The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as 72-year-old Robert Bob Henderson walked slowly toward the recruitment center. His weathered hands gripped a worn leather briefcase, and his back bent slightly under the weight of years and memories. Bob wore a simple brown jacket that had seen better days, with faded patches where military insignia once proudly displayed his service. The young Marines standing outside the building noticed him immediately. Their crisp uniforms and polished boots contrasted sharply with Bob's modest appearance. Sergeant Jake Morrison, a cocky 25-year-old with perfectly styled hair, nudged his companion and smirked. "Look at this old-timer," Jake whispered, loudly enough for his friends to hear. "Probably here to tell us war stories from the Stone Age? Win the raid. Pleased and supported. Probably here to tell. Kansa's seeing the Lokness. Lokses a pot of Inder. And in second to lesses. On the Lokses a pot of in 17. Probably here." Bob continued walking, pretending not to hear the snickers that followed. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he caught enough to understand their tone. He had faced worse than mockery before, much worse. Corporal Danny Rivers, barely 22 and fresh from training, joined in the cruel fun. "Hey, old man, you lost? The retirement home is 3 blocks down the street." The group burst into laughter, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. Bob paused at the entrance, his hand resting on the door handle. For a moment, the weight of their words seemed to press down on his shoulders. He thought about his late wife, Sarah, who had always encouraged him to stand tall despite what others thought. She would have told him to ignore these young men and focus on why he came here today. The recruitment center buzzed with activity as Bob entered. Young people filled out forms at metal desks while recruiters in pressed uniforms guided them through the process. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow that reminded Bob of military installations from decades past. Behind the reception desk sat Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a professional woman in her 30s who had served 2 tours overseas. She looked up as Bob approached, her expression shifting from routine politeness to genuine curiosity when she saw his age. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice respectful but puzzled. It was unusual for someone Bob's age to visit a recruitment center. "I'm here to speak with whoever handles veteran affairs," Bob said quietly, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had shouted orders across battlefields long ago. "I have some information that might be useful for your new recruits." Maria nodded and picked up her phone. "Let me see who's available. Please have a seat over there, sir." She. Over. She. Bob settled into a plastic chair near the window, placing his briefcase carefully beside his feet. Through the glass, he could see the group of Marines still gathered outside, their conversation animated and loud. Jake was in the middle of what appeared to be an impressive story, using his hands to gesture dramatically, while his audience hung on every word. "Those kids think they know everything," Bob muttered to himself, remembering his own youthful arrogance from 50 years ago. Back then, he too had thought experience meant nothing compared to fresh training and modern equipment. A few minutes later, a tall man in his 40s approached Bob's chair. Lieutenant Colonel James Parker had the bearing of someone who had earned his rank through years of dedicated service. His uniform was immaculate, and his expression serious but kind. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Parker." Bob stood slowly, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Yes, sir. I was hoping to share some experiences with your new Marines. Maybe help them understand what real combat looks like before they face it themselves." Parker studied Bob's face, noting the deep lines around his eyes and the way he carried himself despite his age. There was something familiar about this man, though he couldn't place exactly what it was. "What branch did you serve in, Mr. Henderson?" "Marines, sir. Enlisted in 1969, served until 1999. Saw action in Vietnam, Grenada, and the Gulf War." Bob's voice grew stronger as he spoke about his service, the pride evident despite his humble demeanor. Outside the window, Jake had noticed Bob talking with the lieutenant colonel. "Look at that old guy bothering Parker," he said to his friends. "Probably trying to relive his glory days. I bet he was just some supply clerk or mechanic, pretending to be a war hero." The other Marines laughed, but Corporal Sarah Mitchell, who had been quiet until now, frowned slightly. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, and she had learned to respect veterans regardless of their appearance. "Maybe we should give him a chance," she suggested. "Come on, Mitchell," Jake scoffed. "What could some old guy possibly teach us? We've got the latest training, the best equipment, and real combat experience from Afghanistan and Iraq. That old-timer probably spent his whole career polishing boots and counting supplies." Back inside, Lieutenant Colonel Parker was becoming increasingly interested in Bob's story. The old man spoke with quiet authority about tactics and battlefield conditions that could only come from real experience. There was no boasting, no exaggeration, just the calm recollection of someone who had seen terrible things and lived to tell about them. "I appreciate you coming in, Mr. Henderson. I think our young Marines could benefit from hearing your perspective. Many of them think modern warfare has made older tactics obsolete." Bob nodded knowingly. "I thought the same thing when I was their age, sir. It wasn't until I found myself pinned down in a rice paddy with nothing but my training and my fellow Marines that I understood what service really meant." As they talked, more Marines gathered outside the building. Word had spread about the old man inside, and opinions were divided. Some, like Jake and Danny, continued to mock him from a distance. Others, influenced by more experienced non-commissioned officers, remained respectfully quiet. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 deployments, watched the younger Marines with growing disapproval. He had served under officers who started as young lieutenants in Vietnam and knew the value of experience over arrogance. "You kids need to show some respect," Rodriguez said firmly. "That man served his country before most of you were even born." Jake rolled his eyes. "With respect, Sergeant. Just because someone's old doesn't mean they deserve special treatment. We're the new generation of Marines. We've adapted to modern combat." Inside the building, Lieutenant Colonel Parker was checking his watch. "Mr. Henderson, we have a briefing starting in 20 minutes. Would you be willing to share some thoughts with our Marines? Nothing formal, just some real-world perspective." Bob's eyes lit up for the first time since arriving at the base. "I'd be honored, sir. Though I should warn you, some of your young people outside might not appreciate what an old man has to say." Parker glanced through the window at the gathering crowd of Marines. He had been observing their behavior and attitudes, and what he saw concerned him. Too much confidence. Not enough humility. These were the traits that got young soldiers killed in combat. "Let them think what they want, Mr. Henderson. Experience has a way of speaking for itself." As the time for the briefing approached, Bob opened his briefcase and pulled out several items. There was a faded photograph of his unit in Vietnam, a Bronze Star medal in a small case, and a letter written on official stationery that he handled with particular care. Lieutenant Colonel Parker's eyes widened as he glimpsed the letterhead on the document Bob held. The seal at the top was unmistakable, and the signature at the bottom made his breath catch in his throat. "Mr. Henderson," Parker said slowly, his voice filled with new understanding. "I think there's something about your service record that we need to discuss before the briefing begins." Bob smiled sadly, remembering all the times his appearance had led people to underestimate him. "There usually is, sir. People see an old man and forget that we all started young once." Outside, Jake was still holding court with his audience, completely unaware that everything he thought he knew about the man inside was about to change dramatically. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and shadows grew shorter, but the real revelations were only just beginning. Lieutenant Colonel Parker stared at the document in Bob's weathered hands, his military composure cracking slightly as he processed what he was seeing. The official letterhead bore the seal of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the signature at the bottom belonged to someone Parker had only seen in photographs and official ceremonies. "Mr. Henderson," Parker said carefully, his voice dropping to a whisper, This document. It's signed by General Morrison. The General Morrison. Bob nodded quietly, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. He was Colonel Morrison back then, serving as my commanding officer during Operation Frequent Wind. The evacuation of Saigon in 1975. Parker's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the modest old man sitting before him with the implications of what he was seeing. General Thomas Morrison was a living legend in the Marine Corps, a three-star general whose tactical brilliance had saved countless lives during some of the most dangerous operations in military history. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what exactly does this document say? Bob's eyes grew distant, as if he were looking through the walls of the recruitment center and into the past. It's a commendation for actions during the evacuation. We had to hold the embassy perimeter while civilians were being airlifted out. 3 companies of North Vietnamese regulars were moving in fast, and our orders were to hold at all costs. Outside the building, the group of young Marines had grown larger. Jake was in the middle of another story about his deployment to Iraq, describing how his squad had handled an insurgent attack with precision and bravery. His audience listened with rapt attention, impressed by his confidence and detailed tactical knowledge. The thing about combat, Jake said, puffing out his chest slightly, is that it requires split-second decisions and modern training. These old guys from Vietnam were fighting a completely different kind of war. Guerrilla tactics, jungle warfare, outdated equipment. Nothing like what we face today. Special sign, we know ferries about, even off the small. We haven't made it mine, and the roan. Corporal Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in the group. Something about Jake's dismissive attitude toward veterans bothered her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Her grandfather had always been reluctant to talk about his service. But when he did, there was a weight to his words that Jake's stories seemed to lack. Inside the recruitment center, Bob continued his quiet explanation to Lieutenant Colonel Parker. We were down to our last ammunition when Colonel Morrison made a decision that probably saved 300 lives. He called in an artillery strike on our own position, knowing that we could take cover in the embassy basement, while the incoming rounds would scatter the enemy forces. Parker leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. That's an incredibly dangerous tactical decision. One miscalculation, and you would have killed your own men. Morrison knew exactly what he was doing, Bob said with quiet admiration. He had calculated the blast radius down to the meter, timed it perfectly with our movement to the basement, and coordinated with the naval guns offshore to ensure precision targeting. It was the most brilliant piece of tactical thinking I witnessed in 30 years of service. As Bob spoke, Lieutenant Colonel Parker began to understand why the old man had come to the recruitment center. This wasn't just about sharing war stories with young Marines. This was about teaching them the difference between confidence and competence, between swagger and genuine leadership. Mr. Henderson, would you be willing to share this story during our briefing? I think our Marines need to hear about real tactical decision-making under pressure. Bob glanced through the window at the young Marines gathered outside. Jake was still talking animatedly, his hands moving to illustrate some complex maneuver he had supposedly executed under fire. The others hung on his every word, clearly impressed by his apparent expertise. I'm not sure they're interested in hearing from someone like me, Bob said honestly. I've been getting looks and comments since I arrived. They seem to think age makes a person irrelevant. Parker's jaw tightened as he observed the scene outside. He had been watching the group dynamics among his Marines, and what he saw concerned him greatly. Too much ego, not enough respect for experience. These were the kinds of attitudes that led to tactical mistakes and unnecessary casualties. Let me handle that, sir. It's time these Marines learned something about respect and the chain of command. Parker stood and walked to the window, tapping sharply on the glass. The sound caught the attention of the Marines outside, and they turned to see their commanding officer gesturing for them to come inside. Jake's confident expression faltered slightly as he realized they were being summoned. Formation, now, Parker called through the glass, his voice carrying the authority of years of command. The Marines quickly assembled in neat rows, their earlier casual attitudes replaced by military discipline. As they filed into the recruitment center, Jake caught sight of Bob sitting quietly in his plastic chair. The old man looked even more out of place, surrounded by the crisp uniforms and youthful energy of the assembled Marines. Jake exchanged a knowing glance with Danny, both of them wondering why their commanding officer had called them inside to listen to some elderly visitor. Lieutenant Colonel Parker positioned himself at the front of the group, his bearing commanding immediate attention. "Marines, I want you to meet Mr. Robert Henderson. He's here today to share some experiences from his service with our Corps." A few polite nods greeted this announcement, but Jake's expression remained skeptical. He had heard plenty of war stories from older veterans, and most of them seemed to involve exaggerated tales of heroism that probably bore little resemblance to reality. Now, Mr. Henderson served 3 decades in the Marines, Parker continued, including combat tours in Vietnam, Grenada, and the Persian Gulf. He's here because he believes you might benefit from hearing about real combat leadership. Bob stood slowly, his briefcase in hand. The contrast between his modest appearance and the polished Marines before him was striking. He looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. "Thank you, Colonel Parker," Bob said softly. Jake suppressed a smirk. This was exactly what he had expected. Some old guy who wanted to relive his glory days by boring them with outdated stories. He glanced around at his fellow Marines, seeing similar expressions of polite tolerance mixed with barely concealed impatience. "I want to tell you about a decision made under fire," Bob began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "It was April 1975, and we were tasked with holding the American embassy in Saigon while civilians were being evacuated." Some of the Marines perked up slightly. Combat stories were always more interesting than lectures about military protocol or equipment maintenance. But Jake remained unconvinced that anything this old man had experienced could be relevant to modern warfare. "We had 300 American personnel and South Vietnamese allies trapped inside the embassy compound," Bob continued. "Intelligence reports indicated that 3 companies of North Vietnamese regulars were converging on our position from different directions." Bob opened his briefcase and pulled out the faded photograph of his unit. The black and white image showed young Marines in combat gear, their faces dirty and exhausted but determined. In the center of the group stood a young officer with intense eyes and a confident bearing. "This is my unit, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. We were responsible for the northern perimeter of the embassy compound." Bob's finger pointed to various faces in the photograph. "That's Corporal Jackson, killed holding the main gate. Private Williams died covering the evacuation of wounded civilians. Sergeant Cooper, who saved 6 families by holding a choke point single-handedly." The mood in the room began to shift as Bob spoke. His quiet, matter-of-fact tone carried more weight than any dramatic storytelling could have achieved. These weren't boastful tales of personal heroism, but respectful remembrances of fallen comrades. "Our commanding officer was Colonel Morrison," Bob continued, pointing to the young officer in the photograph. 28 years old, and facing the most difficult tactical decision of his career. Jake's attention was finally captured despite himself. A 28-year-old colonel making life-or-death decisions under fire was something he could relate to, regardless of when it had happened. The enemy forces were closing in from 3 directions, and we were running low on ammunition. Standard defensive tactics weren't going to work because we couldn't abandon our positions to consolidate. The civilians were still being airlifted from the embassy roof, and any break in our perimeter would result in a massacre. Bob paused, looking directly at Jake and the other young Marines. Colonel Morrison had to choose between following standard procedures and improvising a solution that had never been attempted before. "What would you have done in his position?" Jake shifted uncomfortably under Bob's direct gaze, suddenly realizing that the old man was expecting an actual answer, not just polite attention. Around him, the other Marines waited to see how he would respond to the tactical question. "Well," Jake began, trying to sound confident, "I would probably call for air support and establish overlapping fields of fire to maximize defensive coverage." Bob nodded thoughtfully. Those are good conventional tactics, son. But what if I told you that air support was unavailable due to surface-to-air missiles, and that overlapping fields of fire would leave gaps in coverage that the enemy could exploit? Jake's confidence wavered slightly. He hadn't expected follow-up questions that challenged his initial assessment. Then, I guess I would. Consolidate positions and form a tighter perimeter? That would mean abandoning the landing zone on the embassy roof. Bob replied gently. The helicopters couldn't land safely, and 300 people would be trapped, with no escape route. The room fell silent as Jake realized he had no good answer. Every conventional tactical solution seemed to create new problems that he hadn't considered. Around him, the other Marines were beginning to understand that this old man was presenting them with a real-world scenario that had no easy solutions. Colonel Morrison faced exactly this dilemma, Bob continued, opening his briefcase again. He had minutes to make a decision that would determine whether those 300 people lived or died. Bob pulled out the official document that Lieutenant Colonel Parker had seen earlier, handling it with careful reverence. What he decided to do was call in an artillery strike on our own position. The Marines stared at Bob in shock. Corporal Mitchell spoke up first, her voice filled with disbelief. "Sir, that's suicide. You'd be killing your own men." "That's exactly what I thought when I heard the order over the radio," Bob admitted. But Colonel Morrison had calculated something that none of us understood at the time. He knew the exact blast radius of the incoming shells, the precise timing needed to get us into the embassy basement, and the perfect coordinates to scatter the enemy forces without destroying the landing zone. Bob's voice grew stronger as he continued. He ordered us to fall back to predetermined positions in the basement exactly 90 seconds before impact. The artillery rounds landed in a perfect pattern that created a barrier of smoke and debris between the enemy forces and our perimeter, while leaving clear approach routes for our evacuation helicopters. Lieutenant Colonel Parker stepped forward, his expression serious. "Marines, Mr. Henderson is describing one of the most brilliant tactical decisions in modern military history. That operation saved 300 lives and became a case study taught at the Naval War College." Jake felt his earlier arrogance crumbling as he began to understand the complexity of what he was hearing. This wasn't some outdated war story from a bygone era. This was tactical genius under impossible pressure, executed by someone barely older than he was now. But the most important part of the story, Bob continued, isn't the tactical brilliance. It's what happened afterward. Bob carefully unfolded the official document, revealing typed text on formal military letterhead. 3 months later, Colonel Morrison was investigated by a military tribunal for ordering artillery fire on his own position. The initial report suggested that he had recklessly endangered American lives through an unauthorized and dangerous tactical decision. The Marines leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story now. Even Jake had forgotten his earlier skepticism as he waited to hear what happened next. "I was called to testify at that hearing," Bob said quietly, "along with every other Marine who survived the embassy evacuation. We had to explain to a panel of senior officers exactly what we had witnessed and whether we believed Colonel Morrison's actions were justified." Bob's hands trembled slightly as he held the document. "This is the final report from that investigation. It took 6 months to complete, and during that entire time, Colonel Morrison's career hung in the balance. He could have been court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and discharged in disgrace." Corporal Mitchell couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "What did the investigation conclude? Quite sir?" Bob smiled for the first time since entering the recruitment center. "They determined that Colonel Morrison's tactical decision was not only justified, but represented the highest level of military leadership under extreme conditions. He was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, and his tactical innovation became standard doctrine for evacuation operations." The room erupted in murmurs of amazement and respect. Jake found himself looking at the old man with completely new eyes. This wasn't some supply clerk telling exaggerated war stories. This was a witness to genuine military history, someone who had been present during events that shaped modern military doctrine. "But here's the part that really matters to you young Marines," Bob continued, his voice carrying new authority. Colonel Morrison didn't make that decision alone. He relied on the experience and expertise of every Marine in his unit, including enlisted men like myself who had been in combat before. Bob pointed to the photograph again, his finger tracing the faces of the young Marines. Sergeant Cooper had fought in urban environments and understood how artillery could be used to create smoke barriers. Private Williams had training in demolitions and knew how buildings would respond to nearby explosions. Corporal Jackson had studied enemy tactics and predicted their likely approach routes. The old man's eyes met Jake's directly. Colonel Morrison's genius wasn't in making a brilliant decision by himself. It was in listening to the experience and knowledge of everyone around him, regardless of their rank or age. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks as he understood the pointed nature of Bob's words. His earlier mockery and dismissive attitude suddenly seemed not just disrespectful, but tactically dangerous. In a real combat situation, his arrogance could have gotten people killed. Lieutenant Colonel Parker stepped forward again, holding a tablet computer. Marines, I think there's something else you need to see before Mr. Henderson continues his story. Parker touched the screen several times, then turned the tablet around to show a photograph of a distinguished military officer in dress uniform. The man's chest was covered with ribbons and medals, his bearing unmistakably that of senior command authority. "This is General Thomas Morrison today," Parker announced. "Currently serving as Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps, and one of the most respected leaders in our military." Jake stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the young colonel in Bob's faded picture with the three-star general on the tablet screen. Slowly, the full implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. "Mr. Henderson," Parker continued, "would you like to tell them about your relationship with General Morrison?" Bob stood straighter, his modest demeanor shifting slightly as he prepared to reveal something he had kept quiet throughout the entire story. "General Morrison and I have remained in contact over the years. He's been kind enough to write letters of recommendation for various programs I've been involved with." Bob reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a newer document, this one bearing recent dates and official seals. "In fact, he specifically requested that I come here today to speak with your unit." The room fell completely silent as the implications of this revelation hit home. Lieutenant Colonel Parker's expression was carefully neutral, but Jake could see something like satisfaction in his commander's eyes. "You see," Bob said gently, his voice carrying no trace of anger or vindictiveness, despite the treatment he had received, "General Morrison is concerned about reports he's been receiving from various Marine installations. Reports about young Marines who confuse confidence with competence, who mistake modern equipment for tactical superiority." Bob's gaze swept across the assembled Marines, settling briefly on each face. "He asked me to come here and share this story not to criticize anyone, but to remind you that experience and wisdom are just as valuable today as they were 50 years ago." Jake felt his face burning with shame as he remembered his mocking comments from just an hour earlier. Around him, the other Marines who had participated in ridiculing the old man looked equally uncomfortable. "The general wanted you to understand," Bob continued, "that the Marines who will face combat in the future will need every advantage they can get. That includes learning from the experiences of those who went before, regardless of how old or modest they might appear." Bob carefully folded his documents and placed them back in his briefcase. "He also wanted me to tell you that the Marine Corps is not just about individual heroes making spectacular decisions. It's about teams of professionals who respect each other's knowledge and experience, who listen to wisdom wherever they find it." Lieutenant Colonel Parker looked directly at Jake and the other Marines who had been gathered outside earlier. "I think some of you owe Mr. Henderson an apology." Jake stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Sir, I'm sorry. We had no idea who you were or what you had done. We were completely out of line." Bob waved away the apology with a gentle smile. "Son, you don't need to apologize to me, but you might want to think about what assumptions you're making about the people around you. Experience comes in many forms, and it's not always wearing the uniform you expect." As the Marines filed out of the recruitment center, Jake lingered behind the others. He approached Bob hesitantly, unsure of how to express what he was feeling. Mr. Henderson, Jake said quietly, would you be willing to tell us more stories sometime? About Colonel Morrison and the other Marines you served with? Bob's weathered face creased into a genuine smile. I'd be honored, son. And maybe you could tell me about your experiences too. We old Marines can always learn something from the new generation. As Bob walked slowly toward the exit, his modest appearance unchanged but his presence somehow transformed in the eyes of everyone who had heard his story, Jake realized that he had learned something more valuable than any tactical manual could teach. Respect wasn't something you earned through swagger and confidence. It was something you gave freely to those who had earned it through service and sacrifice, regardless of how they looked or how old they might be.